So I don't know how we haven't already used this prompt, Mike. Perhaps we should be feeding all of the podcasts into ChatGPT to tell us. But I'm going to ask you today the prompt that you get on ChatGPT when you go onto the site. And that is, what can I help with?
Can you find a 1,000 or so people who would like to purchase my social media card game?
Well, 1 billion users. Let's get the plugin.
Yeah, 1 billion users, which I will note this week, OpenAI announced that they are aiming to get 1 billion users on ChatGPT. So this all ties together.
Oh my God. Do you think they took inspiration from the Kickstarter?
They must have, but I would like them to send 1 billion users to the Kickstarter. We are not quite at our threshold of support to actually make the game go into production. But if you are listening to this, I know you will like this game because it is all about social media and it is fun for the whole family to play.
Yeah.
So if you are listening to this and you have not backed our 1 billion users game on Kickstarter, you can just go to Kickstarter and search 1 billion users. Please check it out. We need more backers. And if you know other people who are interested in online speech and trust and safety, and you want to have a fun game to play that will also help you explain trust and safety and social media and all this kind of stuff, please do it. I hate to beg, but I need to beg.
I'm going to buy 5 more packs.
There we go. We have a discount. If you buy 5, we have a discount.
I'm going to do it.
But anyways, Ben, what can I help you with today?
What can you help with? I am incredibly jet lagged, Mike. I've just landed back from your fair nation after a week of work there, and I do not know what day or time it is. I have not figured out how to actually speak, as you can tell. So any advice, any help on how to get back to a normal rhythm of sleeping would be much appreciated. Let's see how this goes.
Yes. This may be an interesting one. I can confirm that. Well, one, I was up late last night working on stuff, and I was texting Ben, who was in Chicago, and this was not that many hours ago.
No.
And now he is in London, and he showed me his bag that he had just thrown in the corner after getting back home in time to record this. So we are both working on quite little sleep, and Ben even less than I. So this may be a very fun or very strange episode, depending on where things go.
Buckle up, everyone. Hello and welcome to Ctrl-Alt-Speech, your weekly roundup of the major stories about online speech, content moderation, and internet regulation. It's December the 6th, 2024, and this week's episode is brought to you with financial support from the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund and by today's sponsor, Internet Society, a global nonprofit that advocates for an open, globally connected, secure, and trustworthy internet for everyone. I'm Ben Whitelaw. I'm the founder and editor of Everything in Moderation. At least I am, or was the last time I checked. And I'm with an equally kind of bleary-eyed Mike Masnick for altogether different reasons. It's good to be here, Mike. We haven't been in these respective chairs for a few weeks.
Yeah, that's right. We took off last week. We missed all the big stories during Thanksgiving week, and then the week before that, you were traveling, so you were not here. And so it's been a little while since we've been able to do this together.
Indeed. We've got a lot to cover today, partly because we took a break last week. Happy Thanksgiving again to you and to our listeners. We have a really good bonus chat at the end of today's episode with some super smart folks from the Internet Society around social media bans in Canada and Australia and age verification in general. So stick around for that at the end of today's show. And we won't cover those kinds of stories today just because we do that really well with those folks. We're going to dive straight into what is essentially, Mike, a breaking story. It's a live story that you essentially woke up, rubbed your eyes, and have dived into. It's the TikTok case. It's back on the agenda.
Yeah. So we knew that there was supposed to be a ruling coming down basically any day. This is the U.S. law that, in theory, forces ByteDance to divest of TikTok in the U.S. or forces the app stores and ISPs to block access to it. And they are supposed to either divest or will have access blocked on January the 19th. And there's a whole sort of political side story to this, which is that our incoming returning president, Donald Trump, who originally was the one who proposed the TikTok ban and tried to do so in a very ham-fisted way that failed 4 years ago, has now completely flipped positions, perhaps because he was backed heavily by one of ByteDance's biggest investors, but has insisted that he's going to protect TikTok. But he comes into office, I think, a day or two after this law goes into effect. And so TikTok had challenged the law, and it went to the DC Circuit, which is in the appeals court, and they came down with their ruling today, basically saying that the law is just fine. There is no problems with the law, and TikTok must obey it, and ByteDance must obey it. This ruling did come out literally about an hour before we are recording. I have read what I think are the most salient points in it. However, given the timing, I may make some mistakes in terms of this because I have not had a chance to go through it in great detail.
Have you even had a coffee, Mike?
Yeah, I have not actually. Yeah. Anyways, so I think they're wrong.
Okay. Tell us why.
Is my quick summary. It's interesting because the government tried to argue that there were no First Amendment issues at all and that the case could be decided without even considering the First Amendment. The court went in a different direction and said that the government was wrong, but that the First Amendment does apply here. And then once you say that the First Amendment does apply, then there's a question of which level of scrutiny. And there are different levels, have to be passed in order for the law to be considered constitutional. The highest bar is strict scrutiny. And then there are lower bars. And the government had argued that if the First Amendment does apply, you should go for one of the lower bars. ByteDance had argued that it should be strict scrutiny, which is the hardest to pass. The court notes that there isn't a comparable situation that says which of the levels of scrutiny should apply. Okay. And so they actually choose not to say which level should apply, though there is a concurring opinion by one of the judges suggesting which level should apply. But the court says it doesn't matter because we think that this law passes even the highest bar, strict scrutiny. Okay. And so then they just analyze it based on strict scrutiny. And I think they do it, in my one read through it, I think they do a terrible job of it. They basically they very strongly buy into the claims by the US government of the national security concerns, even though they admit that no actual evidence is presented for those. But they basically say, well, the US government, a lot of people in the US government say that we should be concerned, and therefore we're just going to take that as fact. This is not uncommon in the US court system when the government says, well, we have national security concerns and blah, blah, blah. We can't tell you what they are. We're just really concerned. The courts are often willing to go along with that. That has led to a whole bunch of really terrible things having to do with civil liberties and civil rights and all sorts of stuff going back decades. But that seems to happen again here, where they're just like, the national security concerns seem totally legit. And, ByteDance hasn't given us anything to reject it. They admit multiple times that a lot of these concerns are totally speculative. And yet, because ByteDance can't respond to the speculative concerns, therefore, this is all okay. There's a whole bunch of other little stuff in here that, again, is just kind of like, well, ByteDance has said we have all these other less restrictive means of doing this, which is part of the strict scrutiny test. And the court is like, nah, we don't think any of those are good enough. I mean, ByteDance really pushed this idea that they would separate out all the operations, which they've mostly done. Everything is hosted in the US by Oracle. They've given Oracle the power to audit stuff. They even offered the US government an off switch, that they could, push a button and turn off TikTok in the case that something really bad happened. And the government was like, nah, that doesn't really satisfy what the government is doing here. There are a bunch of other oddities in here. There were issues around specifically targeting, the bill actually names TikTok, which seems like it's singling them out for different treatment. And the court kind of waves that off and says, well, no, that's not really true, even though it does mention it. They said at one point, it's not punishment. If it was a bill of attainder, which is a specific thing where it's just targeting someone for punishment, they said, yes, it only names TikTok, but not for punishment. and therefore it's not a bill of attainder. There are all
Right.
of these like really odd things. So the big question now is kind of like what happens next? Like, does TikTok get shut off on January 19th and be gone for 2 days, and then Trump comes into office and suddenly changes position and allows TikTok to come back?
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I think, and I could be there's some procedural weirdness in terms of how this law was written, in terms
Hmm.
of like forcing it to go straight to the circuit court rather than a district court, which would be the normal thing. I assume that they can now go to the Supreme Court and ask for a stay on this ruling in order to appeal it, and maybe that puts the decision off past January 19th and allows Trump to get into office and then sort of, do something to keep TikTok, unless he decides that he maybe doesn't want TikTok. We don't really know at this point.
Who knows what side of the bed Donald Trump will wake up
Yes.
on? So it's really interesting to me, Mike. Thanks for unpacking that. It's really interesting to me that all of the work done by TikTok to essentially kind of separate it out as a
Yeah.
distinct legal entity under this kind of Project Texas umbrella that it came up with a few years back actually has seemingly not worked at all. It has not proven to be persuasive to, in this case at all, as to the national security threat still. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that the kind of all of that effort has been kind of fallen on deaf ears?
I mean, there is some element of it, which is just honestly, it feels like general fear of China. And,
Right.
and that comes through in the ruling too. Like you see repeatedly just talk of, the PRC, the PRC this, the PRC that. And even if they say they're not going to, if the PRC comes down and demands that they do this or that, they will have to obey. And therefore, that is the overriding concern. And, there were stories that came out in the press from like former TikTok employees saying that employees in China still had access to data,
Right.
and that's noted in the decision. They point that out, and so they say, they just don't trust that this is real. It's sort of, the judges seem to feel that this was kind of a fictional setup, and they don't really trust that Oracle's ability to audit it is actually meaningful, because again, they feel that the PRC could come down and do all of this. The other argument that is made too is that it's really just focused on the PRC. I mean, because they say, one of the reasons why they claim that this isn't a First Amendment violation is because if the company does divest, they say all of the same content and all of the same moderation could still occur. There would be no change to the expressive nature of things. The only thing we are doing is trying to disconnect the PRC from TikTok.
Right.
And so they feel that the Project Texas setup and the Oracle audits and the US government like off button don't separate the company from the PRC. And so that's where the court comes down.
They'd only be happy if the PRC sold ByteDance, or ByteDance changed owners or changed hands.
Yeah.
That's the only way this would actually kind of change the outcome in many sense.
Yeah, and I think for a variety of reasons, I think it's wrong. I think it's there are other precedents on this that they sort of poo-poo, and we're just like, that doesn't really apply here. But it is something that happens. I think it's a bad look. I think it's a bad look for, a supposedly free country in the US to sort of take this viewpoint. And I think it will justify all sorts of other bad stuff from elsewhere as well, based on things like this. I think it's a bad look. I know some people really are concerned, and there may be legitimate reasons to be concerned about the Chinese government and their connections here. But I just feel that this law goes against basic American principles on things, and I'm disappointed by the ruling, which, again, I've only read it once and really focused on the First Amendment section, which is sort of the second half of the ruling, and it strikes me as very unconvincing.
Yeah, and that national security concern has yet to be proven as real, or anything beyond really hypothetical at this stage.
Yep.
Okay.
And, that frustrates me. I mean, I have this come up in all sorts of other cases around like Fourth Amendment stuff and encryption, and just, the willingness of the courts to accept the government just sort of giving this blanket statement that this is a national security concern without proof is just kind of frustrating.
Yeah. Okay. It links nicely to our next story, Mike, which you have figured out. It's a TikTok story, but it's about a country that we don't often talk about in Ctrl-Alt-Speech, Romania. And I guess this is kind of really what in some senses, the threat that the courts and the government in the US are trying to kind of mitigate against, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of interestingly related. There's an election going on this coming Sunday in Romania, but in the first round of the election, it's sort of a two-round election. The first round to figure out who are the top two candidates, and then the final election is with just those top two candidates. There was a surprise second place finish that knocked out the incumbent. The incumbent, I believe, came in third, and so is not taking part in the election this weekend. There was a candidate, and I may pronounce his name wrong, but Kalin Georgescu, who was considered a sort of mostly unknown, far-right, populist candidate who sort of came out of nowhere with a big TikTok following. And he has been sort of very pro-Russia, pro-Putin, and in fact, a lot of his successful TikToks are sort of reminiscent of Putin-style press appearances, riding a horse, doing judo, apparently running on a track without breaking a sweat. It's just sort of this like physical prowess.
Nothing to, who doesn't like that? That sounds like a great TikTok viewing experience.
Yes, yeah. And so he built up a really big following on TikTok. The polls in the country had suggested that he was not going to get that many votes. And a lot of people, it appears, sort of chalked up his big TikTok following to foreign influence campaigns. They also noted that those videos were like highly stylized and produced, and there were questions of who was doing some of the producing and the stylizing behind it. There were questions about whether or not the followers were real, were they foreign efforts, were they bots. There were questions around influencers who were promoting the videos, and were they paid or not.
I found this a really interesting point around like whether this candidate was marked in the same way as other political candidates, basically suggesting that they weren't kind of tagged as a political candidate running an election and therefore got a larger reach than the other candidates, which is a really interesting kind of element to this, isn't there?
Yeah, and that's unclear because TikTok denies that. But the deal is, because there are restrictions on political advertising within Romania, if all the candidates are treated as candidates, then in theory there were limitations on kind of what sorts of promotions they could do. And if they were paying influencers to promote, is that a political ad, and how does that apply? And so there are all these questions. And the suggestion from many, including some government officials, is that TikTok didn't designate him as a politician, as a candidate, and therefore didn't have these restrictions. And that allowed his videos to go much further and build up a bigger following. Yeah. Again, TikTok denies it, so it's a little unclear whether or not that is true. There is, though, that one of the things that TikTok did do was at one point they did remove what they referred to as a covert network that was trying to boost his videos. And so they did something. They certainly paid attention to something and found some inauthentic behavior behind him, and that they claim that they stopped. And they also said that they found some similar types of inauthentic behavior for some of the other candidates.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that they did nothing. They were willing to step up and do something, but Romanian officials feel pretty sketched out by this, and they've asked the EU to investigate. And, it brings up all the questions that happen whenever there are unexpected results in elections and everyone's looking for explanations. And these days, oftentimes they quickly jump to, well, it was this internet platform that caused the problem.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple of interesting points here. In some ways, this story is one we've seen many times before, which is platform being used by political candidate with the kind of looming threat of foreign interference in the background. And, there's countless examples of that. Cambridge Analytica being the kind of most famous one, I guess. And it's nice to see that things don't change in the best part of a decade. But I was really interested in, if that is the case, if there is a kind of lack of oversight here. Romania's pretty small, it has 20 million citizens. 8 million of those apparently use TikTok or have a kind of TikTok account. So it's a significant number. Why was it that there wasn't really, I guess, more attention paid to making sure that candidates were given the same kind of platform? And I decided to kind of go into the DSA data, Mike, and find out how many moderators Romania has, or how many are Romanian speaking. And so there are, according to the DSA report from January to June this year, there are 95 Romanian speaking moderators
Okay.
for a country of 20 million. And we don't really know if that's good or bad. It doesn't necessarily take into account, I guess, people setting policy either. That's probably just the folks who are looking at reports and appeals and those kinds of things. But it doesn't seem a lot compared to other countries. So the Netherlands, which has roughly the same number of citizens, we don't know exactly how many users of TikTok, but they have 160 moderators speaking Dutch.
So roughly double.
So roughly double. Sweden has roughly the same number of moderators, 99, but has half the population. And again, we don't know how many of those
users,
people use TikTok. So again, it's interesting to me the kind of how resources are applied. And again, this is a tale as old as time, how platforms in the kind of non-core markets set policy and operationalize policy is something that we see time and time again as a sticking point. Do you think that's kind of relevant here? Does that feel like a path we trod a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it is one of these big questions that comes up all the time. So many of these discussions, and we try to, one of the reasons you and I are always looking for stories outside of the US and the big countries that everybody talks about is because there is an important story there about how these companies handle it in the, less followed countries where less attention is paid to them.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a huge story. And, there is this element of this one where I sort of feel like, I think a lot of people really believe that so much of his following in this case were bots that they didn't think that the votes would follow. And yet the votes did. And so there was this part of me when I first saw this story where I was like, and, the first thing I was reading was like, oh, it's all fake followers and bots. I was like, yeah, but it wasn't fake voters,
Yeah.
So something is happening here. But to be honest too, like, I don't know that you can say necessarily that like, oh, is 95 or whatever moderators too little? I don't know. And we don't know, like, was that not enough? Were the policies not in place? Again, there's the whole thing where like TikTok has denied this and they did take down some inauthentic behavior. So we have partial information, not full information. If the EU does an investigation, it would be really interesting to find out if more details come out of it. But it is sort of an interesting story to pay attention to and to see what comes of this.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think the other part of this story and something that kind of is a thread that runs through the US TikTok ban as well is a media story, really. It's about the fact that there is so many people kind of consuming TikTok and the shift away from traditional media to new forms of media, the fact that politicians can bypass traditional forms of media, as this candidate has done, and still perform very well in an early round. So we'll keep a tabs. I've never said this before, Mike, but I'll be keeping tabs on the Romanian election this Sunday.
There you go. This coming Sunday is my birthday, so I will celebrate it by paying attention to the Romanian election as well.
Happy birthday in advance, and
Thank you.
What a way to celebrate.
Yes.
So if those kind of two stories paired together, I guess, represent in some ways the kind of ghost of antitrust past, Mike, the way that...
What a segue. What a segue.
I think the next story is the ghost of antitrust future. The next one you picked out and is about a man that I actually didn't know about up until an hour or so ago. But he's an incredibly frightening looking man, I'll have to say. And I'm not sure if I'm ever going to forget his face. So tell us about Andrew Ferguson and what he's come out with this week.
Oh, my goodness. So Andrew Ferguson is an FTC commissioner and is a Republican. The FTC has 5 commissioners. 3 are appointed by whichever party has the presidency and 2 are the other party. So right now there are 2 Republican FTC commissioners and 3 Democratic ones that will flip in January. And Andrew Ferguson is one of the Republican commissioners. He is very clearly vying for the chair, taking over what Lina Khan's position is right now under a Trump administration. And there was a New York Post article today or yesterday that sort of detailed there are 3 leading candidates: the 2 current FTC commissioners, which is Ferguson, and the other one is Melissa Holyoke. And then there's a third person who worked for Senator Mike Lee that he's really pushing for to be chair. And the question that people around Trump are apparently asking is like, which one of these is going to be toughest on, they say big tech, but they really mean Trump's enemies, especially considering how much support he got from certain tech sectors this time around. It'll be, the companies that they don't like. And so the FTC took a fairly typical FTC action this week against an e-commerce platform called Goat. The details aren't even that interesting in the case, but basically they lied about shipping times. People were paying for premium shipping and not getting it in time. And then also they had a buyer protection thing where they're saying, like, if anything goes wrong, we'll protect you. And then they weren't living up to that. The FTC took action on them, basically saying, they were making promises and they weren't living up to it. It's an unfair and deceptive practice. Very typical, standard FTC, nothing at all interesting about that. The other Republican commissioner, Holyoke, put out a concurring statement on this that basically just said, this also proves that we can use the same authorities to go after big tech companies for unfair moderation decisions.
Okay.
Which is nonsense.
Yeah.
But it was like a 1-paragraph thing. And it looks like, to me, at least, Andrew Ferguson then said, okay, I see that. I got to one-up it because we're in a fight here for the chair position.
I raise you
crazy, and put out this like 4-page concurring thing. Again, none of this has anything to do with the ruling on Goat, which is the company that this is ostensibly about, saying like, yes, and I agree with Holyoke that we can use this power to go after unfair moderation. But also, we can use our powers to go after advertisers who stopped advertising on X, because that must be antitrust collusion to censor free speech, and we have to support free speech. And right now, there is only one free speech platform, and it is Elon Musk, the brilliant, wonderful free speech supporter.
Oh,
and,
God.
How dare any other platform censor American speech, and that must be illegal, and how dare they not advertise? So he goes after advertisers who stopped. He goes after GARM, which we've talked about in the past, saying, that was clear evidence of collusion. He goes after NewsGuard, saying that NewsGuard, who I've written about a few times that the Republicans have gone crazy about, NewsGuard, all they do is just say which news sources are trustworthy and which are not. And he sort of admits when he's talking about NewsGuard, like, yes, NewsGuard can have its own opinions, but if multiple companies are basing decisions on those opinions, that is antitrust collusion. It is 4 pages of crazy, indicating, once again, like with Brendan Carr, we talked about a few weeks ago, like with Brendan Carr, that these bureaucrats really intend to use the powers of government to attack speech online. And they're framing it all within the language of free speech. The whole thing, over and over again, he talks about how important free speech is, and he does Elon Musk is the only believer in free speech, and every platform has to use the same policies as Elon does, and how dare they not do that?
So just to clarify, so we have a situation where antitrust, as we've talked about in the last couple of weeks of the podcast, which is going to be a big theme within the Trump administration, and he's run out of the FTC, has a guy in Brendan Carr who doesn't know much.
Well, the Brendan Carr is the FCC, not the FTC.
Sorry, yeah. So the FTC commissioners also don't know very much, according to this letter, at least this particular guy. And so we have a situation where like maybe nobody knows anything about.
The question is, do they know, or are they just like putting on a show for Trump, right?
Okay.
And it's just this sort of like populist thing. I don't know Andrew Ferguson that well. Brendan Carr, I know a little bit, and so I know he knows that he's lying. Like,
right.
Brendan Carr's smart enough to know what the law is. I don't know enough about Ferguson to know whether or not he knows this is crazy.
Okay.
One of the lines that really got me in this letter was like, he claims at one point that the proof of collusion among big tech companies to censor content in an illegal manner is that simultaneously, he specifically says simultaneously, all of the big tech platforms blocked all discussion and reporting on the Hunter Biden laptop in 2020.
Which just wasn't the case.
None of that happened, right?
Right.
The only thing that happened was two companies took some action, Twitter and Facebook. The action that Twitter took was it blocked the link. It did not block any other reporting on it. There was other reporting on it. It did not block any discussion of it. There was lots of other discussion on it. In fact, it was like a trending topic. The only thing they did was they blocked the link to a single New York Post story for 24 hours. Then they reversed their policy and allowed that link to be shared. The only thing that Facebook did was it said, well, there's some questions about this story, so we're going to keep it out of the trending. It won't go into the trending topics. And they reversed that policy relatively quickly. That was the only thing it did. But he declares unequivocally that the entire tech industry simultaneously blocked all discussion of this. And one of the things that gets me is I pointed out earlier this year that Elon Musk did all that and more when apparently Iranian hackers got access to the Trump campaign's dossier on J.D. Vance, and they passed around, and most media sources didn't bite on it. Finally, Ken Klippenstein, who has a Substack, posted it, and Elon banned Ken. He blocked all links to any part of Ken's Substack, not just that one article. And he, pulled down all sorts of stuff. And to this day, I don't think you can share that. He did let Ken back on the platform after like 2 weeks. So everything that they have accused Twitter of doing to the Hunter Biden laptop story, Elon has done and more and gone much further. And yet in this comment from this FTC commissioner, he claims that Elon is the big free speech supporter, and the actions taken on the Hunter Biden laptop, which didn't happen, prove that they're illegal, censoring, collusion, antitrust nonsense. Everything about this.
You've got your hands on your head, Mike.
It's so wrong. Yeah. But this is unfortunately the world that we're living in, and it gives a sense of how the incoming administration is going to attack content moderation. They're going to make these claims. They are going to try and use every legal lever they have, even as they are crazy and totally counterfactual to reality.
Yeah, the idea that the FTC could prove that platforms coordinated on policy changes or anything like that would be so difficult to do, right? If this actually was, is a route you want to go down, how do you go about saying that this company over here has done the same thing as this company over here in a way that amounts to collusion?
Yeah, well, the thing that they can do, and they probably will do, is that they can conduct investigations and they can demand to see all sorts of internal files. And that is what is going to happen almost certainly. And then I would guess what would come out of it is probably a really misleading findings, and they'll release things selectively that take things out of context and make claims that are just not accurate. And it's going to be a mess. And this is why we're seeing tech companies, trying to kiss the ring of Donald Trump and try and make nice, because they know if they don't, they're going to face all of this kind of authoritarian nonsense.
Yeah, no, indeed. And currying favor is actually, a very good segue into our next story. It's fast becoming
the theme. I did it on purpose, Ben.
The theme of this episode. So, we have a situation where FTC commissioners are cozying up to the new administration. We also have a situation where Meta, in a very coordinated way, is doing the same thing. And so this week, a number of different outlets, including the Financial Times and The Verge, reported on Nick Clegg, the president of global affairs at Meta, talking about how Meta essentially overstepped the line when it came to content moderation during COVID. The comments were made in a reporter briefing, which is does happen, but it's a very kind of coordinated, very kind of controlled environment for a very senior person within Meta to kind of make these statements. And the coverage has been essentially that Meta is not apologizing, but admitting that it overstepped the line in terms of COVID information control during that period. And this comes on the back of, you'll remember, Mike, that letter by Mark Zuckerberg to Jim Jordan, which we had a good laugh about. Which
I thought it was a cry.
we cried a bit. It felt like a letter that had been written at gunpoint. I remember saying, and almost kind of made to write that. And it was clearly in lieu of this situation, right? Where Donald Trump becomes president again. And you have a situation, as was reported this week, where Zuckerberg is invited to Mar-a-Lago to talk about the future of tech policy out of the US. So in a number of different ways, we have, here we have Meta cozying up to the new administration. We have the FTC commissioners doing the same. Is there anybody that has any dignity left? I think this stuff is so obvious, right? It's so obvious. And in some respects, I'm frustrated about the way that it's reported in this way, because apart from the line that says this is a briefing with Nick Clegg and some journalists who've been invited there, it's quite clearly, designed to be a signal to the Trump administration of, we know what you're going to ask us to do and we're happy to do it.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. This was totally a messaging thing. It was, a coordinated attempt by the company to lay out this message that will be embraced by the sort of MAGA faithful, to insist that it proves, this will be extended, right? They'll say it proves that not only that Meta was overly willing to suppress speech, but it will just be reinforced with the claim that the demands for that came from the government, which is the part that he didn't say that, but that is the claim that lots of people are making. And so it's a spineless capitulation to this argument. And basically it's giving the Republicans ammo to claim that we were right all along. We were unfairly targeted. We were unfairly censored. And even Meta admits it. And we'll see that over and over again. And people will point to this as if it's proof. I had somebody yell at me this week.
Only one?
Well, there were a few people, but someone was yelling at me about this, where I was talking about some of this, and they were saying, well, Zuckerberg admitted under oath that the US government pressured him to take down content he didn't want to take, which is not what actually happened.
Right.
But like, the message gets out there, and Meta knows what they're doing when they say this. And, I understand why they're doing it. They feel like they need to do it to hopefully avoid costly stuff, but it shows a real lack of principles as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and if you're a trust and safety professional working in Meta who probably spent countless hours trying to figure out what the policy should be during an evolving situation that no one has ever seen before, that was COVID, and no one will ever see, for a long time, that's going to be really, really tough to take.
It's demoralizing, right? The reality is what these companies should be doing, and they don't do, is saying, like, these are really, really, really difficult decisions. And there was no way to get it right. There was simply no way. I talk about the sort of impossibility theorem here. There is no way to get it right. And that is extra true in a case where you have something that is brand new. Nobody understands, nobody understood the details of COVID. We didn't know what was right. We didn't know what was wrong. And people made choices, and lots of people made wrong choices. Some of them made wrong choices because they just didn't have enough information, and as more information came out, they adjusted. Some people made wrong choices because they had crazy ideas in their head. There were all sorts of wrong choices that were made along the way, and it wasn't because of like any in many cases, it wasn't because of bad actions or bad ideas. I think, the companies tried to put forth their best effort. That's what Meta should be saying. Yes, we may have made mistakes, but we made best efforts based on what kind of information we had. We took this seriously. We wanted to keep people safe. And because of the changing nature of the information environment, we had to make decisions on the fly. And instead, he comes out and he gives this statement, which is basically like, we took down too much content because there was too much pressure on us. Like, come on, stand up, have a spine. It's really, really frustrating to me. This was a chance. This was an opportunity for them to educate people on how trust and safety works and what the real purpose of trust and safety is. Yeah. And instead, he's feeding into the narrative that it's this awful censorship machine. And it's really, really frustrating.
Yeah, I've talked to a few folks recently about trust and safety's kind of marketing problem. The fact that, it needs to kind of present itself continually as that difficult challenge, those impossible trade-offs, and it needs to kind of completely an ongoing message that out. It doesn't help when Nick Clegg comes out and gives a soft briefing to loads of journalists that the opposite is true. He does say, interestingly, just before we move on, about how AI has all this potential, but right now there are some really pissed off people on Meta's platforms for the fact that they make mistakes and remove innocuous or innocent content. And again, just it's kind of completely crazy because it was literally 2 weeks ago we were talking about how Threads was an absolute mess of a moderation process, and you had all of these kind of terms that should have been moderated being taken down. So I'd love for media to be a bit more critical and clear on what it is that senior people like Clegg are saying, and I think that's really part of our job to do that too.
They gotta put this in context, like put his statements in context, and I didn't feel like the media was really doing that.
No, indeed. Mike, I'm gonna we can't finish on that low note. We've got a couple of lighter stories, but I'm gonna throw to you to pick. Let's end with ChatGPT, since that's how we started today's episode. Tell us about this kind of fun, lighthearted story.
Yeah, this was kind of an interesting story where suddenly it started spreading wide that ChatGPT would break if you tried to get it to say anything about the name David Mayer. And I saw it first in a very funny post on Blue Sky from Andy Baio, who's a really interesting guy, has the site waxy.org, and he does lots of really interesting stuff. But he had heard that, and so he created this question for ChatGPT, which was combine the first name of the artist who recorded Ziggy Stardust and the last name of the artist who recorded Your Body is a Wonderland into a single name. And ChatGPT starts and says the artist who recorded Ziggy Stardust is David Bowie, and the artist who recorded Your Body is a Wonderland is John Mayer. Combining their names, and it says David, and then it breaks, and it says, I am unable to produce a response. It refuses to produce the name David Mayer. And
weird.
What people then quickly discovered was that there was a short list of names that ChatGPT will break if you try and get it to produce those names. And then the hunt was on to sort of figure out who they were and why.
Odd. So, and did they find out what the cause was? Like, why doesn't ChatGPT like these names?
So, as far as anyone can tell, and I don't think OpenAI has come out and said anything yet. And I will note that they have fixed the David Mayer one so that it now does work. But the other names on the list still do not work.
Okay.
It appears that OpenAI just created a block list it appears to be about 6 names. There might be more, but there's a block list that if you try and get it to produce that name, it will break. And it just it doesn't break in a nice way. It just, will go halfway through a question and then say, I am unable to produce a response.
I really love the idea that there's some incredibly well-paid, some of the smartest kind of machine learning engineers, sat next to some of the world's brightest trust and safety experts, some of whom we know probably, sat together being like, what are the list of 6 names that we've got to add to a block list?
Yeah. And it's so obviously just a straight up block list that says we will not produce these names. And people have gone through and reasoned out some of them, and they're all slightly different. There's a few that we don't quite know why. There was one person, Guido Scorza, who is a data protection expert in Italy, and he had posted that he had used the GDPR's right to erasure process against OpenAI and said, basically, you have to forget everything about me. And the only way that they could figure out to do so was to put him on this block list because they don't actually remember anything about him. Like this is the thing that a lot of people don't understand about these systems is it's not a big database. It's not going in and collecting stuff. It is training and just thinking about stuff. So the only way to say never produce any information on Guido Scorza is to put him on there are better ways, but this was the sort of fast and quick way. Yeah. There are other people, the Brian Hood was a mayor in Australia who claimed that it produced defamatory content about him, and he threatened to sue. And so that one probably came up first. Somebody had actually told me about that one like a year and a half ago when it came up, and I had meant to investigate it, and then I just never got to it. Jonathan Turley, who's a law professor and sort of a famously sort of Trumpian law professor, went on this big rant of claiming also that ChatGPT had defamed him, and so he's on the list. The weird one is Jonathan Zittrain, who I know and asked, what the hell? What did you do to get on this list? And he has no idea.
Right.
So he doesn't know what's going on. I joked with him that like, oh, are you trying to come up with something to prove a point or something about all this? He's like, I did nothing. So,
and he didn't know he was on ChatGPT's naughty step.
He had found it. He had actually discovered it. So he added himself when everyone was pointing out to this list of names. He pointed out like he had discovered a few months ago that ChatGPT breaks on his name. And so, it's just basically it's like this really simple way. I understand probably why it happened, because all these people, except for Jonathan, as far as we know, got really mad. We still don't know which David Mayer there is. There's speculation. There's a few different. There's also a David Faber, and nobody's sure which one that is. But the other ones, like, people got mad, and OpenAI probably was like, you know what? This guy is a fucking headache. And therefore, just put him on the ban list. Like, let's not deal with this, because we don't want to go through a lawsuit and have to do this. And there's no other way to like effectively, because they're, they don't understand. It's not that ChatGPT is defamatory. It's whatever the prompt is led to defamation. And it's not that we're collecting data on this guy, but he thinks we are. And do we really want to fight it in court? Just put him on the ban list.
Put him on the list.
I'm pretty sure that's the kind of thing that happened.
Yeah.
You would hope that a company with as many resources and, as you noted, as many smart engineers would come up with a more sophisticated way than this, but they haven't. And so, I know how things like that happen, and I'm sure it was just kind of like, just make this headache go away in the easiest way possible. And that means every time you try and produce this name, we're going to break it.
Yeah, interesting. Just as an aside, the OpenAI put out some research in the past week around kind of red teaming and new and novel ways. I wonder if they should be reading their own research.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So yeah, if David May is listening to the podcast, if he's a regular listener, make yourself known. We would love to know what you did to be put on the shit list of ChatGPT.
Yeah, and then you got taken off. So if you have a legal complaint, get it going again.
Yeah, we know some lawyers. Great, thanks, Mike. That's not the kind of end of today's episode. We've got a great bonus chat. I don't know if you want to kind of give us a preview of that.
Yeah, so this was really great. I had this discussion just yesterday. It's a topic that we've talked about a lot, the social media age bans in Australia and how they're popping up elsewhere. And so this is a discussion I had with two folks from the Internet Society, Natalie Campbell, who's the Senior Director of North American Government and Regulatory Affairs, and John Perino, who's a Senior Policy and Advocacy Expert. And they're concerned about these age restrictions and age verification. And we talked about Australia, and also Canada has a bill that is moving forward. That one of the incredible things in the chat was that it would require places like Starbucks to verify the age of anyone who wants to use the Wi-Fi in Starbucks.
Wow.
And all sorts of stuff. And so they're sort of concerned about these laws, the proliferation of these laws, what it means for the open internet, and what age verification requirements would mean. A really fascinating discussion, and we'll go to that right now. Natalie, John, welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you here. I wanted to start by talking about the law that just passed in Australia, which effectively bans those under 16 from social media. John, can you talk through the details of that law, including sort of which sites are impacted, and how does the Australian government expect sites to know the age of their visitors?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. And, for quick background for listeners, this legislation moved through in about less than 2 weeks, and there was a consultation period open, less than 24 hours. The Australian social media age verification stuff really, really flew through. And there's a lot that we still don't know, even though the legislation passed, especially on what social media platforms would be required to do in order to comply with this. So right now, essentially all we know is that government ID would not be required. That should include things like a passport or government issued driver's license, also a digital ID. And we know that the social media age ban is for Australians under the age of 16. And then the final thing that was kind of added on late was a digital duty of care, which again is to be determined. So the bottom line on this is much of the bill is to be determined. They don't know what age verification would be, as they say, reasonable for the social media platforms to use. And as a lot of the comments pointed out, there was actually already an age verification study ongoing. And that's still going on which tools maybe work best, what the trade-offs are in different age verification methods. The Australian government was already doing this. They don't have the results. They probably won't have the results until about 6 months before the social media platforms have to comply with this.
I know that we've seen a bunch of other countries also exploring similar ideas around age verification. On the podcast, we've talked about it in the UK and somewhat in the US to a lesser extent. There are a couple different issues in the US, but also now Canada is exploring a similar issue. So, Natalie, can you talk through what the proposal in Canada is about?
Sure. So, Senate Bill S-210, this is an act to restrict young persons' online access to sexually explicit material, is very close to becoming a law. This bill has been flying under the radar for quite a long time. I don't think that people are taking it very seriously because most Senate bills don't make it to law. But this has found its way into the very late stages of our parliamentary process. And it's probably the most dangerous bill to the internet in Canada right now. And one of the main reasons for that is because of its age verification mandates that would apply to virtually every intermediary on the internet and some that are not on the internet as well. So essentially, what the bill tries to do is to prevent young people from access to sexually explicit material, which is defined extremely broadly, and makes it so that every intermediary that would play a part in facilitating sexually explicit material for profit online would have to verify a user's age or face very high fines. So this, this is probably the most extreme age verification proposal we've seen so far because it's not just targeting websites, it's targeting internet service providers, content delivery networks, search engines, email services, even a Starbucks location that's providing access to Wi-Fi, because what content is flowing through those pipes could be sexually explicit material. They now have a duty to verify users' age. And in doing so, like it's different when we're talking about websites doing this, but when we're thinking about every single intermediary on the internet having a duty to verify users' age, that gets really problematic when we're thinking about an open internet. First, because most traffic is encrypted and it's not possible for most infrastructure intermediaries to know what's flowing through the pipes. And even if they could, content doesn't flow through the internet as a whole piece of content. It's packets. And so it becomes extremely difficult to, one, identify what is sexually explicit material and, what is Canada's definition of this type of content. And then second of all, having to decide to try and identify that stuff means you can't use things like encryption, which is the foundation of security for every service and user on the internet. So it's very concerning in that the implications for security online, but also the fact that you're placing huge barriers to access because now as an internet user, because a lot of intermediaries won't know what's sexually explicit material, they might just start doing age verification to everyone. And that means I now, as somebody who's based in Canada, would have to trust a whole lot of entities with very personal information, whether it's government ID or, biometrics. I'm having to trust a lot of third parties who I might not have any direct relationship with my personal information, which is a huge barrier to privacy and anonymity online. So this is, from an open internet aspect, this is super problematic because you're creating huge barriers to access for people who might not be able to get government issued ID or might not be able to use the internet without the promise of anonymity, which is a huge hurdle for a lot of people in marginalized communities and young people as well. But also the fact that this has huge implications for security online. and, not enabling intermediaries to use encryption, that could be extremely devastating to people's security online and making people vulnerable to a whole range of bad stuff that I don't think was the intention of this bill.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned, just really quickly, I wanted to follow up on one point. You mentioned the fact that since it hits every intermediary, the potential that, like a Starbucks, if you wanted internet in a Starbucks, is the idea there that Starbucks would have to not just check your ID, but like record it somehow? Is that part of the fear, that if you want to get on the Wi-Fi at Starbucks, you have to first prove how old you are?
Well, this is the problem, is that the way that it defines who this bill applies to is internet service provider. But the definition it uses for that is a person who provides access to the internet content hosting, or electronic mail. So that person who provides internet access
Yes.
could mean Starbucks. It could mean that, Starbucks has to know, what are you looking at when you're accessing the internet?
Yeah.
Or just show us your ID if you want to use the Wi-Fi, right? So
Right.
problematic in both senses. And just a reminder that please use VPNs.
So, I mean, so we're seeing this all over. Obviously, Australia and Canada, as you guys discussed. We've discussed the UK in the past. There are various bills in the US that also touch on this, and elsewhere around the world. What should we make of this trend? Why is this all of a sudden happening? We've had the internet, obviously, for decades now. Why is it suddenly that everyone is trying to pass it, these kind of age-related bans or age verification ideas? John, do you want to start there?
Yeah, I mean, to that point, it certainly feels like everything is happening all at once,
Yes.
everywhere, in every corner of the world.
Yeah.
I mean, we're seeing this, as you mentioned. The UK has been working on this almost a decade, but their age verification guidance comes out in January. The European Union is working on this. There are almost 24 US states that have passed age verification for adult websites, more with social media. It really is happening everywhere. Why? It's a whole bunch of factors. One kind of interesting story with the Australia legislation is it seems to have stemmed, depending on who you ask, from Jonathan Haidt's book. And, there has been a lot of discussion because of recent literature. The Anxious Generation is Jonathan Haidt's book, as I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with. There's just been more discussion on this. There's been a lot of discussion in the US, the Kids Online Safety Act, but there are, true age verification bills being introduced. There's even a case going to the Supreme Court, and that's the Free Speech Coalition v. Paxton case. And that's something that the Internet Society weighed in on with an amicus. We joined with the Center for Democracy and Technology, New America's Open Technology Institute, and some academics on that case. And, the thing that we think doesn't get talked about enough is that age verification laws are not just about young people.
Yeah.
Age verification laws are about everyone. If not done right, this puts everyone's privacy, security at risk. And like Natalie already said, this can be discriminatory. The marginalized communities, and there's really interesting research on this, marginalized communities can benefit the most from social media, can benefit the most from being online. It can be more difficult for them to get online. There can be more social factors that make it, more challenging if their parent is over their shoulder. If it's a young person, generally in their worlds, it's more difficult to make those types of connections. So what we're really focused on is that everyone can get access to the internet, that it's not gating off access to the internet, to news, information, health, entertainment, right? So this is really going to be a challenge. And we see so many pieces of regulation that are being implemented and introduced right now. Luckily, at the Internet Society, we have an incredible community. For instance, our Australia chapter jumps to action. There was less than 24 hours to file comments. They made the deadline, got the comments in, and that's so important. And so many of our local, regional chapters are engaging with governments in their home countries on this issue. So on that point, there's really good debate on this, really great interaction. More and more technologists are getting involved in this, more standards development organizations. So the engineers who actually make the internet function, right, are getting involved on this. So that's encouraging, but it really is happening everywhere at once. And we really need to make sure that those who need the internet the most can actually be safe online and are not having their privacy and security exposed through all this.
So you've both talked a little bit about sort of the implications of this and the reasons why there are concerns. But Natalie, I want to finish up with you and just say, for policymakers, some of whom might be listening to this, hopefully, who are looking at these laws and thinking about them, what kinds of factors, what should they be considering before, proposing or voting for these kinds of laws?
So first, it's really important to understand that the Internet Society works to make sure that the internet is for everyone. And when we talk about an open internet, we're talking about making sure we're lowering barriers to access to the internet. We also want a healthy internet. We are, like John mentioned, we're a huge community, not just the Internet Society, but our chapters and members and organizational members around the world. We all want a healthy internet and care about making sure there are safe spaces for people online. But we also want to make sure that, things like encryption and the fundamentals of a secure internet are not undermined, and that people don't experience barriers to access that could be complete hurdles to accessing the internet in the first place. So, it's not to say that there might never be a solution for age verification that could not hinder things like security and open internet, but policymakers really do have to be thinking through how could their proposals impact people's access to the internet and their safety online. And we have a tool that helps us analyze these proposals. It's called the Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit. We think of it like an environmental impact assessment for the internet. And so what we do is offer ourselves to work with governments who are thinking about whatever issues they're working on that may relate to the internet, and we'll often use this framework that describes what the internet needs to exist in the first place and to be more open, globally connected, secure, and trustworthy. And we help them think through how might particular proposal impact these goals for a healthy internet. And so we always are available to work with governments to think through these aspects, but we have a toolkit that policymakers can use themselves. And we think that it's really important that we just don't jump to law proposals that don't consider those impacts on the internet, because such as the case in Canada, there can be very extreme consequences for people's access to the internet and their very safety and security online.
All right. Well, Natalie and John, thank you for coming on the podcast, and thank you for all the good work that the Internet Society does. And I hope if anyone's listening to this and you are working on a bill like this or thinking about these kinds of laws, that you listen closely and take a look at what the Internet Society is doing on this and what resources they have available. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks for listening to Ctrl-Alt-Speech. Subscribe now to get our weekly episodes as soon as they're released. If your company or organization is interested in sponsoring the podcast, contact us by visiting Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. That's Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. This podcast is produced with financial support from the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund, a fiscally sponsored multi-donor fund at Global Impact that supports charitable activities to build a more robust, capable, and inclusive trust and safety ecosystem.